All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Andrea Greenhoot from the University of Kansas. She is the director for their Center for Teaching and Learning called the Center for Teaching Excellence, and she's a professor in psychology studying cognitive development and memory. And in her work through the center, she applies a lot of the cognitive research that she does to many of the curricular and professional development initiatives that she leads. She has a number of grants ranging from foundations like Spencer and Teagle to the federal government, National Science Foundation, that's really funding some incredibly innovative and creative initiatives in higher education that span STEM, humanities, you name it, and really towards the goal of helping our diverse undergraduates succeed at research institutions. She's also a very well-known innovator for multi-institutional collaborations as the Associate Director for the Bayview Alliance, and that's a consortium of research universities that are working together to explore strategies to support student success, and she's been an active member and leader in that group. So without further ado, it is my pleasure, as I said, to introduce Andrea.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the nice introduction, Erin. And Adrian and Erin, you've been excellent hosts, and I really appreciate the invitation to come here. So I do want to get one piece of business on off the table, and that is that most people call me Dia. So just so you know, feel free to call me Dia. I've had times when I've heard people talking right next to me saying, so-and-so said we should talk to Dia. Who's that? So anyway, or they'll say, you know, I'll have somebody that I've been hanging out with for a year, and then they hear that somebody call me Andrea, and they think I'm being called the wrong name. All right. So I talked a little bit with Adrian and Erin ahead of time about what they were hoping for and what some of the conditions are here that might, you know, or what are some of the goals of this event. And I heard a couple of things. One is that it sounds like one of the challenges that you all are really dealing with right now is the increase in students that are coming to the university and also into your classes. And so I am going to present some example courses that have been the subject of a lot of innovation. And I've deliberately chosen examples that are quite large, but I have lots of other examples to talk about. So feel free to ask me questions about anything else. So I did choose that. The other thing that I was able to glean is that, you know, I know that this is an inaugural event, and also from the comments of the provost that, you know, one of the things that's happening here is that faculty and instructors are increasingly recognizing the value of community around teaching, and especially interdisciplinary community. And so I'm going to try to touch on that. I've tried to pick some examples of work that are happening in different disciplines, but are influenced by ideas from a variety of different disciplines. So the work is really quite interdisciplinary. Okay, so I want to just start by mentioning or laying the groundwork by sort of identifying some of the issues that we're facing here in higher education. And your provost did me a favor by already getting this going. He referred to a few things, but there are really a number of drivers for change right now in the higher education ecosystem. And I've just grouped them into 3 different categories, and there are probably more. But one of those that I'm sure everybody is acutely aware of is technology. So we're in an era where information is so readily available in your pocket. You can find out the answer, whether it's credible or not, or evidence-based or not, to any question you might ask. There are all kinds of new online learning opportunities. There's a proliferation of new tools and technologies for learning. Okay, so those are some of the things. At the same time, We also have, we're also at a point where there are many insights about learning and development that are being applied in the classroom. So there are decades of research in cognitive science and cognitive development that tell us a little something about how our students learn. And actually, I was sitting here talking to two of your colleagues, the Bjorks, who are doing a lot of that work. And at the same time, so we've had an accumulation of research findings that really help us understand the way humans learn. At the same time, we've also, in recent years, had hundreds of translations of that work into the classroom, demonstrating how these principles can be applied. Okay, so lots of new insights about that. And then we also have a number of societal changes and challenges. So one is rapid diversification of the college-going population, changes in workforce needs, societal demands and expectations. So as your provost mentioned, it is no longer okay for students to not be successful in the university. We have relatively persistent achievement gaps across higher education, and it sounds like those are, an issue at UCLA as well as pretty much every campus in the country. Achievement gaps between students who have been historically represented well in higher education and those who have not. We need to, the expectation is that we will serve the needs of all of our students and help all of our students succeed. The good news is that actually there are lots of strategies that we can use that support the learning of all students. So there are known ways to close those gaps. Okay, so those are some of the drivers. Those are things that I think about a lot. The question is, for a faculty member, or an instructor, how do we adapt to this highly dynamic ecosystem? Everything is changing, and things feel like they're changing so fast. And think about like all the new pedagogical strategies that are out there. Okay, I'm just going to flash a few. So writing across the curriculum, flipped classrooms, adaptive tutorials, all kinds of scaffolding, problem-based learning, case studies, active learning, student response systems, clickers. Repeated practice, metacognitive interventions, authentic assignments, transparency, two-stage exams. You got all that? How many of you saw something that you've tried on this? Oh, good. All right. Okay, it's a lot. All right. So how do you decide what to do? Where do you start? I think it can be a little overwhelming. So what I wanted to do was to share a framework that I think can bring some coherence to faculty innovation and instructional improvement or improvement of their learners. So I argue that this is a powerful yet simple approach, and actually I think I saw this approach in many of the lightning talks that I heard earlier today. So the approach that I want to showcase for you today that I think can be the foundation for everything else is the idea of teaching as a process of inquiry into your students' learning. Okay, so the idea behind this is you're redefining teaching as an act of inquiry into students' learning. So what does that look like? Start up here. I don't know if is there a pointer? I'm afraid. Oh yeah, good. Identify a goal or question about students' learning. So what do you want your students to do differently or more of, less of, more deeply? Often that's where our questioning begins. And then the next step is to design and implement some new approaches. So experiment with some new strategies for helping students do that thing that you want them to do more deeply or differently. Next step is examine student work. All right, so I think a lot of people do these two things. This is one that I'm going to really push. Examining student work. So evaluate and analyze student learning or whatever indicators you have of whether that thing you just invested in is actually working and having the desired effect. reflect on the evidence that you gather, and use that to inform the next iteration of the class. So I'm going to come back to this in a second. I want to get you to think a little bit about where you might start with this. So here's a question that I'm going to throw out to all of you. We're going to do a little 3-minute think pair share. So turn to the person, one or two people around you. Share a time when you were surprised by your students' work or performance. So there was something in your students' work or in their performance that surprised you, either positively or negatively. All right, so just take a couple of minutes to share an example of a time when you were surprised. So I'll tell you my own story. So I started teaching at KU in 1999, and the class, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the class that I started with, but it's an upper level class on cognitive development. So it's right in my field, and I had all these students that were majors, and I was really excited, and I had already I had taught extensively at my graduate institution, UNC Chapel Hill, and so, but I had never taught this class. So I go in and I worked very hard on lectures, and I had all these lectures that were very well prepared, and I did those lectures, and then about, 6 weeks into the semester, I gave a midterm, and I had these great questions that I thought were so cool, asking them to apply all these ideas, and my students did so badly. I think the highest score was in the 60s out of 100, and so I was devastated, and I realized that until that point, I had no idea how my students were understanding the material. I had just totally misjudged them, and I had used, my past experience at a different institution with a different group of students, and because of the teaching methods that I was using, I didn't have, what I was seeing was students were listening to everything I said and writing it down, and that was giving me some good feedback, right? Oh, I guess what I'm saying is compelling, or it's going in and it's getting down. But I really was missing out on opportunities to figure out, to learn about their learning. So that experience then set into motion a new orientation for me, slowly, but I eventually got there, and that's one of the things I'm trying to reveal. Hopefully, can I get this to? My thing is not working now. Okay, so that's my story, and the point is, so I think one of the so the examples that you all shared also have to do with looking for various forms of formal or informal evidence of how students are experiencing and understanding the material. Okay, that is an extremely useful tool in your teaching. So I would argue that if you're going to treat teaching as inquiry into your students' learning, you have to first start by orienting your teaching around your students' learning. Okay, as our former chancellor said, I helped her write her speech one time for another institution that was all about teaching, and she took some ideas that I shared with her, and she put it into this phrase that I love, which is, has teaching occurred if learning has not? So that's kind of the idea, and we could probably debate that, but at a minimum, orient around student learning, and then you have the opportunity to begin experimenting with ways to improve it. If you don't know what's going on inside their head, then it's very hard to do anything more, to engage in this process. And one of the things that we do know in cognitive psychology is we can't directly assess on the outside what's going on inside students' heads. So we have to use other indicators. And some of those indicators are formal, like clicker responses or assessments and assignments. Some of them are a little more informal. So walking around and listening to discussions that students are having can be a very useful one. Okay, so again, so once you start orienting to student learning, then you may begin to look at it in a way that involves inquiry. So students are not doing this thing that I want them to do, or they're doing this thing in a superficial way. How can I get this to change? And what are some strategies that I could adopt to do that? So I saw this idea modeled in many of the examples that were shared in the lightning talk this morning. Several, in most of them, I think the presenter started with something they were trying to puzzle through about their students, something that they were working on to improve. So one example, I'm looking at the list, Jordan Moberg Parker wanted to support her students' ability to interpret scientific research. So she developed the whole CREATE system in order to do that. So a great example of that, of identifying the goal or question about student learning, designing and implementing new approaches, and then examining student work. The examples that I'm going to share with you here also involve really closing the loop. So what I would argue is to be a dynamic teacher in a dynamic higher education ecosystem, this should be our constant cycle of teaching, and it doesn't have to be exhausting. Okay, so let me share a few examples. So in my the class that I just mentioned is the class on cognitive development. I over the years began to make a number of changes to that class in response to various pieces of evidence about how my students were understanding the material. A lot of the changes that I made have really focused on an assignment that is essentially a capstone assignment. It's designed to capture, students work on it across the semester, and it's designed to help build and integrate a number of the skills and understandings that I want students to take away from the class. I worry that my text is too small for people to read in the back. Is that true? Can y'all read in the back? Yeah. So the assignment is an advice column. So what the students have to do, so the other thing I really thought about is, who are my students? And the vast majority of the students that were taking this class are not going to go on to be psychologists or maybe even work in a field directly related to cognitive development. And so I wanted them to do something that had greater relevance to the rest of their lives. And so that's why I developed this advice column assignment. The other thing is that in order to really translate empirical evidence into some recommendations that are readily accessible to a non-psychological audience, you really have to understand the ideas and the research. So one example, so what I would do is to pose sample questions to my students, and they could choose among a range of questions, and then they had to identify research, read and evaluate it, synthesize diverse findings, apply those findings to the real world question, and then write a clear and cohesive argument. One example of question I have up here, this one's slightly dated now because probably all this stuff is you could get on like Netflix or something, but do electronic products like Baby Einstein videos and leapfrog toys really make infants and toddlers smarter? Okay. Another one is about academic redshirting. Is that a familiar term to anybody? So the idea of holding students back from kindergarten or first grade so that they are older, with the concern that they're not quite mature enough to benefit from the academic environment. If they're, especially children with summer birthdays, and it tends to happen with boys and so on. Okay, so when I first when I first implemented this assignment, I found that the students lacked skills in every single area. Okay, so the first time I did the assignment, it was a huge miss. I had hardly anybody had an empirical article. They didn't even know what an empirical article was. They didn't know how to find them. When I did, so they were all coming to meet with me, and I would help them, and my TA would help them. And then when they did find them, they didn't really know how to read them and interpret them. So again, I'm reminded of the example that Jordan provided. So I began to make a number of improvements to the course in order to address some of these skills. So what I'm showing you here is some of the changes that I made over the years. So I can't believe it's been 20 years since I started teaching this class. I only realized when I made this slide. So the first few years, I really focused on simplifying and adding some scaffolding. So the first thing I did was to just break the assignment into smaller steps. So I took something complex, broke it up into steps. Students turned in pieces along the way. That gave me the chance to give them feedback, and more importantly, it enabled me to diagnose where their challenges were. So I got them to the point where they were much better at finding reasonable resources, and then I would see that actually the problem was that they didn't know how to interpret them, or maybe they didn't know how to synthesize them. And the next phase of work focused on improving information literacy. I embedded library instruction into the course. I just identifying the sources a bigger part of the grade. So sometimes just adding weight to components that you want students to attend to. I think about that in terms of limited resources. Okay, so you have a limited number of resources to devote to any set of tasks. If you separate tasks into steps, then that ensures that students will allocate their attention to the individual pieces. Then over the next 10 years or so, I did a number of other things like so again, breaking it up into steps. So students began to, they would find their articles, they would have to be approved. They went back to the drawing board if the articles were irrelevant. They actually had to write a paragraph justifying why the articles they selected were relevant. So because in the early years when they started turning in their articles, much of the time they would just find an article that had the right keyword and throw it in, and when you read it actually had nothing to do with the question that they were supposed to answer, and they often didn't discover that until the night before they had to write their summaries. So again, thinking, what can I ask for that will get students to do this work early? So a simple one is, explain to me why this is a good article. Okay? So once we started doing that, I never had to help another student again on finding reasonable articles. Then we had them summarize the articles, again in a separate step. They would then come into class. We incorporated a peer review and analysis session, so we'd organize them into groups of students that were all addressing the same topic. They all had their own sources, but they engaged in some peer review of summaries of the articles, and then they would sort of help each other in synthesizing the findings. This also gave them the sense that even if they only had 4 or 5 sources, those are 4 or 5 out of a much broader pool of possible resources and literature that bears on the question. We developed some additional supporting assignments that would support synthesis of contradictory research findings. They really struggled in that area. I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. Let me jump to, I'm going to skip that. So here, these are just some, I've already gone through this, but these are some of the stages of the assignment. And then we had a pre-test and a post-test, an abbreviated version of an assignment like this that asked them to use some of these skills so that we could look at change over time. I'm going to jump through this. So here is a summary of performance on some of the key dimensions of the assignment and how it changed over time, over successive iterations of the course. So what I did, I had a rubric that I used to evaluate different dimensions of performance on the advice column. So kind of setting the stage for the arguments and the introduction, the use of research, synthesis of those research findings into coherent conclusions, and then application to the real world question. And what the bars represent is the percent of students who scored at a very high level, intermediate, and low. So the dark blue is the high, light blue is intermediate, white is low. And you can see these are the earlier semesters. And you can see that the area where they're really still struggling is in synthesis. So I was able to use this by looking at distributions of performance on different aspects of the assignment identified in a rubric. I could use this to diagnose where my students are still struggling. And this isn't surprising that this is where they would have a problem, because that is one of the most challenging things. So we built in a bunch of additional scaffolding that really help them understand how you take diverse research findings and weight them according to the strengths and weaknesses and of the research. And once we began to do that, we started to see some real shifts in performance on synthesis. So here I've got almost 50% are scoring at a very high level. And when I started this assignment, I had 0 at this level, so I don't even have any of those early data. This last semester had an even bigger gain, and I want to show you one of the reasons why. The last change that I've made to this assignment is that I now have them publish. So we have a bit of a competition, and we develop as a class a WordPress site, an advice column site, and we take the strongest papers on each topic and we actually publish them. And when we get to that point, actually everybody in the class is involved in refining that winning advice column for showcasing on the website. We disseminate the link. Parents can write in with questions. Students can get extra credit for responding back. So when students started to see that their work was going to connect with a real audience, it really enhanced their ability to synthesize the findings, I think, because they knew that they were going to have to convince a real person who wasn't me that what they were arguing was actually accurate. Okay, or believable. Okay, so that is one example. I want to talk about some work that some of my colleagues have done in classics. So this is a group of 3 classics professors. Emma Scioli has led this work. Pam Gordon and Tara Welch have also contributed. And the 3 of them have collaboratively transformed an intro course to classical mythology over the last few years. This is a large enrollment class. It has 250 or more students. They're mostly first years. It's historically had one of the highest rates of D's, F's, and withdraws of any class on campus. And so they were very invested in trying to make improvements to this class so that students could be more successful, but also they wanted to know if they could make changes that would deepen students' critical reasoning skills and increase their engagement in the work. So because they found that students weren't coming to class, they weren't coming to class prepared, they weren't ready to engage. So they implemented a number of improvements to the class. So in the first round of improvements, they developed some scaffolded assignments. So what they included was, so these were three-part assignments. First, they completed an online assignment before they came to class. They participated in an in-class discussion and then worked on a writing assignment. Okay, so they are providing additional practice, so students are getting prepared for the work that they're going to do in class. They have a chance to engage with other students, engage in collaborative learning in class before they do that writing assignment. And they found that that did improve scores on the final exam by about 10%, and it led to improvements in course grades. But they still had some challenges. They still felt like analytical reasoning was still relatively weak. So in the second iteration, they added some analytical worksheets that gave students practice with some key skills, specifically identifying a thesis and organizing secondary sources. And they found that this improved the thesis statements. It improved the specific things that those worksheets gave them the chance to practice, but there were still a lot of challenges in students' ability to find, evaluate, and use evidence. So in the third iteration, they decided that they were going to make more dramatic changes, and they essentially reworked the entire assessment plan for the class. They dropped the exams altogether that they normally had and said, if we are serious about having this course help build students' critical thinking skills, we need to spend more time on it. And so this is, an insight that I think a lot of us make as we iteratively improve classes. We often realize that the things that we're spending our time and that students are spending their time on are not always the things that we care the most about. So they totally revamped the assignments to be about critical thinking. 7 scaffolded assignments that took this same sort of form, directly addressed the skills they were trying to build that were weak in the previous iterations. They made a few additional changes, like in the online assignments, they began to do these in small groups so that they formed a community outside of class that carried over to inside of class. They began to give low-stakes credit for participating in in-class discussion, and just created greater alignment and transparency so that students had a better sense of why they were doing these assignments and how they related to other things that really matter and count for a lot in the class. Once they did that, they began to see some really big improvements. So these 2 graphs show growth across the 7 assignments in student performance on the argumentation skills and use of evidence. These are both from the rubric that they applied to grade the assignments. So they have a rubric that identifies the different sub-skills. They use it for grading and can readily analyze the distribution of student performance on it to identify where students are doing well and where they still need more support. So clear improvements in those areas. They also were really interested in attendance to the appearance and professionalism of their work as an indicator of engagement, and found that that was generally improving across the 7 assignments as well. Most important, I think, for their goals, though, while they have clear indicators that they're addressing and improving learning, they also are improving student success. So they cut the rate of D's, F's, and W's almost in half, just from one year to the next with these additional changes. So students are being much more successful in the redesigned version of this class. But again, it's something that they have approached gradually and iteratively, and they've used their careful analysis of where students are excelling and where students need more support to really guide how they design the class for the next semester. All right, my last example is from my biology colleagues. So Mark Mort has led this work. He has for years with input from others, taught the Introduction to Organismal Biology. It's also a large enrollment class. It's mostly majors. It's a key prereq in the curriculum. And I'm just going to show you a video that we have a great little video on our center website where he talks about what he changed and why. They essentially flipped the class and implemented pre-class online reading quizzes. They also have post-class questions that students will respond to after class in response to themes that came up. In class, students work in fixed learning teams, and those fixed learning teams review each other to give each other formative feedback over time so that students can improve in their team skills. They replaced much of the lecture with problem solving, case studies, discussion, and then, as you heard, really integrated more reading of scientific papers, interpreting data, and graphs. This set of graphs over here just shows the distribution of points according on the exams according to where how those items align with Bloom's taxonomy. So this is a little bit backwards in that, remember, the simplest kinds of skills are at the top and the most complicated are at the bottom here. But the main point to make here is that they actually have increased the rigor of the class. So that is an important thing to keep in mind when I show you the results. They've looked at learning and success in a lot of ways. One is they've used a pre-post course survey to assess learning gains in key areas of the content. And what you can see, the red bars, so the question number is on the bottom, the red bars are the scores on the pre-test, and the blue scores on the post-test. So students are coming in without much understanding of a number of these concepts, and they're leaving with a much better understanding. These are some learning analytic data. So this graph on the left shows the distribution of grades before and after the transformation of this course. So the blue are the pre-test scores, and so pre-redesign, sorry, and then orange is post-redesign. And you can see that the distribution is shifting over here to the right. So more grades in the particularly in the B and the C level, and reductions of withdraws and Fs and Ds again. So improving student success. This is actually the most interesting finding here. They and several other faculty that we've been working with out of the center have been doing some work to track the impact of changes in one class in courses that are downstream in the curriculum. And so this is an example. What this shows is the percent of change from before to after redesign. So if the bar goes down, we're seeing a reduction in those grades. If the bar goes up from the zero axis, that represents an increase in those grades. And the different colors represent different subgroups of students. So overall, and then they pulled out first generation students, students from underrepresented minorities, and Pell Grant recipients. And so the big take-home message here is that they're seeing many more increases in successful grades. So we consider a successful grade a C or above, and reductions in unsuccessful grades. But those changes are particularly strong for students in underrepresented groups, first generation and Pell Grant recipients. Okay, so they are, with these methods, beginning to close some of those achievement gaps. Okay, so that's just an illustration of how this framework has been applied to promote productive improvements in student learning in a few KU courses. I just want to summarize some of the key pedagogical practices. So again, the idea that I'm pushing here is that if you treat your teaching as an opportunity to inquire about your students' learning, and you're able to identify where they need more assistance and where they're doing well, then the practices sort of follow, okay? And these are some of the things that I think are themes that run throughout the examples that I shared. Repeated practice of key skills, scaffolding by breaking complex tasks into steps, realigning the content and assignments with the things that really matter for students. That's been a big one. Collaborative and active learning, designing, thinking carefully about how to design all the different pieces to support better preparation for class, because the active and collaborative stuff doesn't work as well if students aren't coming in prepared. And then increased transparency. But underneath it all is this overall shift in teacher mindset. And here's another way of thinking about it. I shared the quote from our former chancellor, but this is from a colleague who is at KU in music theory. And he talked about this shift as thinking of as a move to teaching rather than expecting skills. Okay? That much of the time, we're expecting students to do these things. We don't realize that we actually need to teach them how to do some of these things. So you use the inquiry to identify the areas where we need to shift from that expecting into teaching. A few recommendations for implementation, things that have been very influential on the faculty that I showcased here: participating in intellectual communities around teaching. And a lot of these are interdisciplinary. And my colleagues tell me that they get their best ideas, that they get pushed to think outside of the box when they talk to faculty that are in really different disciplines from them. There is also a good place for within-disciplinary collaboration, connection that fosters collaboration. But I think both kinds of community are really important. Another thing I want to emphasize is it's really okay to start small. So the examples that I've shared here represent an accumulation of many changes over the years, but that doesn't mean that to do something worthwhile, you have to totally transform a class. And in fact, for most people, I would recommend that you start with one piece and work it up from there. The other thing is that this way of thinking about teaching can lead pretty readily into ways of representing the intellectual work that's behind your teaching. And we have developed a whole framework for this. I don't have time to talk about it, but I'm happy to answer questions, that we have an NSF grant to try to promote. So I know that some of the folks in SEALS have been sharing this framework, so I just wanted to mention that real quick. So just to sum up, I think redefining teaching as inquiry or as a form of problem solving can make you a part of the dynamic higher education ecosystem instead of the one thing that's not changing. And it draws on tools that we already pretty readily apply in our scholarship. We engage in inquiry all the time. But importantly, I hope you've seen that this is a way to better prepare our students for future learning and for being good citizens. Finally, I would argue that it makes teaching far more rewarding and engaging. So with that, I will answer any questions, talk about any other courses that you might be interested in.
Gaston, yeah?
So I'm a bad student. The graphic show.
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about the biology thing? So what this show, sorry. What this is showing, these bars, if the bar goes up, that means there was an increase from in the number of those grades from pre to post. And so what we're seeing for the most part is that the grades of A, B, and C increased, and the grades of W, F, and D decreased. So in other words, the students, we have more students moving out of the low grade categories and into the successful grade categories. Does that make sense? So the distribution is moving to the right, but that's especially true for students who are underrepresented in higher education. So we're seeing the biggest up bars for students who are underrepresented, and so I guess it's those two, the C and the B.
How I read that the last one category, the green bar, which is really
this one.
No, on the left.
Yeah.
So these are from my course the really low performing students at
right.
the beginning, and when I change everything, I actually lose them, like a part of them, right?
Right. So what this is showing is that the number of withdrawals is decreasing by 15% for those students. What? Yeah. Right. So those are so the number of withdrawals is decreasing from pre to post.
So there's one in the back here, blue shirt.
I just want to ask if you could either repeat the question or give the speaker a mic.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Next question was over here and then here.
Okay, so the question is, how do I know that, or how would you respond to somebody that suggests that this could just be grade inflation? I think that's why I shared a couple of other things. So one is they've done pretty careful analysis of the kinds of things that students are being asked to do. And what they're documenting is that the questions on the exams are actually aimed at a higher level of thinking, at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So students are being asked to do more analysis and application and evaluation, and less of the lower level thinking in the post-redesign version of the class. The other thing that they're showing is that they're actually looking at student learning outcomes and documenting those in a meaningful way as well. So I think it's a great point. We can't just go off of rates of D's, F's, and W's, because there are many ways to achieve change in those scores, and grades are a very indirect measure of learning. But when you can show that both student success and direct measures of learning are shifting, then I think we have a pretty compelling case.
I loved what you said about faculty participating in intellectual communities around teaching, either within discipline or across disciplines. Can you tell us a little bit about what that might look like, what it looks like at your institution, or how you've organized that?
Sure. Yeah, we have a number of different kinds of communities that are aimed at, different, that have different levels of intensity and follow through. So one that the biology group was really active in is called the C21 Course Redesign Consortium. So we started a big active learning course transformation initiative back in 2013. And in conjunction with that, we established this consortium, a university-wide intellectual community of faculty who were really interested in bringing more active learning into their class, and in offloading information delivery into the out-of-class time. Most of the participants were trying to do this in really large classes, and we're finding a lot of challenges. So that group has, over the last several years, gotten together about 5 times a semester for workshops around various issues that are highly relevant to doing that kind of work. That's one where you can just kind of drop in, come and go. So there's not a lot of accountability or continuity, but there's a core group of people that always come, and that really their identity as a teacher is very connected to this now. We also have other shorter term communities that we host. So we do a faculty seminar most years, and that is a small faculty learning community. The participants get a stipend of about $1,000. They propose to work on a course, and the proposal that we ask for asks them to articulate that question that they have about their students' learning up front, and then they meet regularly with a group of maybe a dozen faculty. They read scholarship on teaching, they look at examples, and they progressively redesign their class to address the question that they articulated at the beginning. So those are just two examples. We have another one that's organized around inclusive teaching that we call Diversity Scholars. That's actually a 2-year program. So that group gets together monthly for a full academic year. They redesign a class, but it also has a leadership component where we're trying to set them up as sort of leading or being positioned to be able to lead efforts in their own units. So we do a little bit of that. One of the other things they do is to develop a plan for how they would engage their colleagues in work on equity and inclusion in their own departments.
Other questions? Over here.
That was a lovely presentation. We've been trying to incorporate active learning in the medical school, and one persistent problem is lack of student preparation, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not at a uniform level. So, 10% of the students have studied nothing. Another 25% know 30% of the content. So the range is so huge that when they come back for a flipped classroom or team-based learning session, it's extremely frustrating for the student groups as well as for the instructors. And it's really been a very discouraging aspect of changing or transforming education. I was wondering if you have encountered this and how you addressed it.
Absolutely. And I think, I bet if I were to survey complaints among all of you in here, that many of you would say at some point you've had frustrations around student preparation, right? It's a tough problem, and it can really be a barrier to effective problem-based learning and active and collaborative learning in classes. So we have done a lot of work on that with a lot of faculty. And we have kind of a multi-modal, a multi-method approach. So one is, so essentially we think about it in terms of motivators. What are the things that are motivating students to be prepared? And can you activate as many different kinds of motivation or value as possible? Because different things work for different students who have different goals. So one of the things is it needs to, we recommend that it counts somehow towards their grade, that they do some preparatory work. So whether it's an online quiz that's automatically graded, or maybe in the classics class, students were just participating in a blog discussion with other people in a group, and it was a low-stakes assignment, but they got credit for earnest responses. They did to those blogs. So that's one thing. Now, we've had a lot of faculty that have done that, but then when students come into class, they lecture on the stuff that students just prepared on. And that makes students really mad. So, because now they feel like they're just being gamed. You made me do all this, and now I'm coming into class and you're going to repeat it. So it's also very important, if you're going to hold students accountable for preparation, that you honor that preparation during class time. And that can be tricky if not everybody is buying into the system and coming in prepared. So one of the things that I've seen faculty do is they go hardcore and, say, if you're not prepared, you're just sorry, and you have a couple of weeks like that and students will catch on. If you then add some social accountability, so that students are working in groups, they're working on something where they really need to be prepared, then that can be an additional incentive. And then finally, if the preparation is very clearly aligned to doing better on some other higher stakes assignment, that can be an additional motivator. With the social accountability, that tends to work best if students have to work collaboratively on a product that is graded, and where their contributions are somehow going to be noted. So I'll go back to the biology example. They have fixed learning teams and regular peer review. I've done this in my large courses as well. So students score on the peer review of their contributions to the group actually affects how many points they get on the group activities. If the consensus is from their team members that they put in 80% of the effort, then they get 80% of the points. But they could get more than 100% if they're a real leader. So, but also they can't dominate. So, you have to also be a good listener. So those are some of the things. I think, so I would just think about, like, what are the things that add value to the preparation, and how can you activate as many of those as possible?
Okay. We are actually out of time for more questions. We should give our guest here a round of applause. Thank you.